Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll start out with an interesting tactic that was played in a recent game, and then we'll follow it up with some very interesting technical endgames. Well, let's get started. Here we are. This was played in the German Bundesliga, which is one of the strongest league championships in the world, and White was a very strong grandmaster rated above 2600. And yet, he made an unusual mistake. Here White has two choices to recapture on d5, which was Black's last move, capturing White's knight on d5 with the bishop. So the question is, would you recapture with a pawn or with a queen? I suggest you take a little bit of time and try to see what you would do before you listen further. Well, hopefully you wanted to capture back with a pawn. Well, this is one of those situations when you should simply use the method of elimination, because actually capturing with a queen, which is what White did in the game, is a very big mistake, because the White queen will find itself trapped, and that is of course a very sad story. It seems that the queen is in no danger of being trapped whatsoever, because the d3, d2 and d1 squares seem to be open for retreat if the queen is being attacked. And that is exactly what is a hint, because if the queen could not retreat to any of those squares, then indeed the pawn e7 to e6 could attack it. But wait a minute, there is one more thing. The queen is also attacking the pawn on b5. Okay, so now we know already quite a bit about the position. It's all true. So the question is, what can Black do here to make it all work and trap White's queen? Try to find it on your own before you listen to the solution. And the answer is knight d4. What an amazing move! Putting the knight under the attack of the pawn of the bishop. And it doesn't matter how White captures it, the queen is trapped. That is what happened, and of course White dragged it out and tried to fight, but eventually lost the fight. So let's go back just a moment and think again, what could be an alternative here for White? Of course, the ultimate goal should be not to lose your queen. And the only way to try to achieve that would be to open up a space for the queen by playing e5. White would open up indeed the e4 square. The problem is that now Black has a fork coming as well. By playing knight e2, it's a check, and then of course Black could capture White's valuable rook on c1, and followed by capturing also the pawn on e5, giving Black a clearly much superior position. So what's the moral of the story? Well, whenever you're bringing your queen or thinking to bring your queen into a position where it's surrounded by a lot of enemy pieces, always be super cautious to make sure the queen will have a retreat. So the correct move here was to take with the pawn, and then the game would be still rather complex, and the fight would just be about to begin. And now let's move on to some endgames, as I promised. Here we are. And this position was also reached in a recent game between two top grandmasters, Levon Aronyan from Armenia against the Italian-American Fabiano Caruana. So in this position, which is a very interesting position, it is Black's turn. And let me first start to show you on what happened in the game itself. Black continued with the most natural move, which is to capture White's extra pawn on h5. In normal circumstances, when you see a rook and pawn against rook and pawn, and the two pawns are on the same file with the kings near it, generally it would be a simple draw. However, this is an exception because of the unfortunate temporary positioning of Black's rook. Although it seems doing its job in pinning White's g5 pawn, because imagine if that pawn could advance to g6, that would be a check, and then when the Black king moves to h6, rook h8 would be a checkmate. Of course, all of this is only fantasy because that pawn on g5 is pinned and therefore cannot advance forward at the moment. I suggest you think a little bit on your own, try to spend up to 5 or 10 minutes, or less obviously, and see if you can figure out why this natural move, rook captures pawn, was actually a serious mistake. Then come back and listen to what happened in the game. And indeed, White made a very good move, but actually it's the concept that's important. White made a simple waiting move by playing rook to a8. What's happening now is that Black is in Zugzwang. It means that White does not have any threat. However, because it is Black's turn and Black, or in general in chess, we are unable to say pass, therefore Black has no choice but worsen his position. Obviously, the Black king is stuck, it cannot move, so therefore we're left with two choices, moving the rook or the pawn. However, moving the rook would end the game real quick, exactly for the reason that we already discussed in the previous commentary, that now the Black rook no longer pins White's pawn on g5, and that means that the White pawn can indeed advance, and when the king moves to h6, which is only move, then the checkmate arrives with rook h8. So going back to this position, Black was left with only one reasonable move, and that is to advance the g7 pawn to g6 with a check. And now comes king f6. Now Black doesn't have much of a choice but move the rook, try to activate it, but now the problem is check forces the Black king away from his own pawn, and king simply captures pawn. So now the problem for Black is not only that Black lost the pawn, but more importantly that the Black king will not be able to remain on the promotion square to hold off White's passed g-pawn. Now, of course, White is threatening to checkmate on the following move with rook a8, and neither defense works. For example, if Black plays rook f1, then check, and after the only move, which is to block the check, White just trade rooks, followed by king h7, and then the g-pawn just runs away. It's completely unstoppable. On the other hand, as Black continued in the game with king f8, White chases the king out, and then White's king simply moves forward, and here Black resigned already, because the following would happen. For example, rook g1, the pawn advances. Let's say if the Black rook stays here, the White king just moves to h7, and now if Black tries to hold off the advancement of White's pawn, then check, chasing the king away, and the pawn can just advance, and the win is rather easy, theoretical win, the famous Lucena position. Now let's go back all the way to the beginning and think, if this didn't work, what is still the correct way to continue to save the game. Because of course, black is not lost here at all. In fact, it's a rather easy draw. And this is something so typical for rook endgames, that try to keep your rook as far from the opponent's king as possible. Why? So you can give constant checks. And that's exactly what black should have done here. Starting out not by playing rook h5, but checking with rook f1. Now, for example, if king e6, then rook e1 check. If king f7, then of course not trading rooks, but just simply continuing with the checks. And white has actually a hard time hiding away from all these checks. In fact, black could continue with more checks with rook d1, or can already at this stage just play rook h1, go after the pawn on h5, and here the white king is too far away to help white to create a mating attack, unlike in the game. So this would have been the way to save this game for black. And now let's move on to another endgame, a technical endgame, which has been played. This position was reached by the then world's #1 Magnus Carlsen and the legendary British Grandmaster Nigel Short. In this position, at the moment, we're having even material on the board, but it's quite obvious that black is in major trouble. What's the cause of the trouble? Well, the problem is that the black rook on b8 is unable to move, and therefore it loses a lot of its value. To make it worse, the bishop right next to it has the same problem, because remember, if that bishop could safely develop, then afterwards the black rook would also be liberated from its horrendous position which it's in currently. So the question is, what could black do? Well, a natural move is to play e5, and that's in fact what happened in the game. The idea is clear. Black tries to get the bishop out, so then the rook could get out as well, and black would be off the hook. We'll see in a moment why this wasn't such a great idea. But what else could black do? That's the problem, that black kind of doesn't have any good options. For example, if black would play f6, white would play also a quiet move with a purpose though. The purpose is that unlike after immediately trading knight and then coming in to fork black's bishop and pawn, now after the bishop moves away and if rook takes, the white pawn on c2 will also be hanging. So the simple purpose of white's c3 move in this position is to put the c pawn on a protected square and now threaten to actually trade the knight for the bishop and then come in with the rook to win a pawn. Also, trying to push the issue and attack the knight with bishop c5 wouldn't work out well at all, because that would give up the protection of the d8 square, and after a check white simply wins a piece. So that's certainly out of question completely. Okay, so we're back to the position where we started and where black played e5. Now this has a different problem. Like moving the bishop had the problem that the bishop no longer protected the d8 square, the problem is similar here again, in that now the pawn that just moved, it no longer protects the d5 square, and therefore white immediately played rook d5, creating a double attack on the two black pawns on the 5th rank. But the good news is the bishop at least got out. but of course the prize was hefty, an important pawn. Black played rook d8, trying to get control of the only fully open file, and white played a smart move, bishop d3. This move has several ideas. On one hand, it stops the black rook from entering to d2 to start attacking the white pawns. On another hand, it also eyes towards h7, which is important that in case the black rook would wander away from the back rank, from the 8th rank, and then if the white rook would get to check on a8, it could be unpleasant for black, as the king wouldn't have an escape, so black would only block if they would have that option. Okay, so after bishop d3, the game continued with bishop f6, which is a tricky move in some cases with ideas of advancing the e-pawn and then perhaps getting the pawn on b2. White, trying to prevent any kind of counterplay, simply played e4, and now the bishop on f6 kind of looks silly because it's pretty much impossible that the black e5 pawn would advance in the foreseeable future. Black played rook d4, and now what white needs to do is to mobilize his material advantage, in other words, the advantage on the queen side where white has 3 pawns versus only 1. Generally, you want to play where you're stronger. And white continued with rook b5. On one hand, this move clears the path for white's a-pawn, but not less importantly, the white rook already is eyeing towards black's pawn on b7. So all white needs to do is move that knight out of the way, and then the pawn will be under attack. Black continued with g6, a5, king g7. Obviously black is just making kind of random moves because black does not have any realistic counterplay or target. White played king e2, check, king went back. I guess white realized that there was no need for these king moves, and the bishop went back too. King f3, h5, and now finally white was ready to continue with the plan by playing knight d5, opening up the rook's power on the b file, and now the pawn on b7 is hanging. And black continued with bishop d8 with the idea that if now rook takes pawn, then the bishop would capture on a5. Good news is for white that white has time for everything, including to just simply protect that pawn on a5, and now the b7 pawn is still hanging, so black is in major trouble. Black had to retreat to the initial position of the bishop back to c8 to protect the pawn. Came king e2. Now white has serious threats in trapping the black rook on d4. Black continued with check, king e1. Now the pawn is hanging again, so if the bishop would retreat, in addition to playing the solid king d2, white is even better off immediately playing a6, and then after pawn takes, rook b8, a very nice little skewer, winning one of the two black bishops. So let's go back again. After king e1, black continued, as I said, with f5. When the pawn simply falls, king h6, knight e3, bishop f3, and now of course white has 3 connected passed pawns on the queen side, and it's time to start pushing those pawns. a6 takes, bishop e2, bishop g5, and white doesn't even need to bother with the knight, just keep pushing the pawn, and black resigned. A very nice technical game by the Norwegian superstar Magnus Carlsen. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this position, at first it seems that black is doing quite fine. In fact, being up a full bishop generally would guarantee a win, or certainly it shouldn't be losing for black. However, if white plays correctly in this position, quite amazingly, it is white who is winning. I suggest you take a little bit of time and try to figure out on your own how to win this position for white. It's not so easy, so don't get discouraged if you don't find it or don't find it quickly. Well, amazingly, the first move is actually a sacrifice. G7. This move, of course, threatens to promote the pawn, so therefore black doesn't have many choices other than to take the pawn. And now comes f6. Here white is combining various threats, on one hand attacking the bishop, on the other hand threatening to checkmate on the back rank. Again, black is helpless, must capture the pawn on f6, and now knight f6. And even now, when we look at the position, it's almost unbelievable that with such little material there is so much beauty on the chessboard. White has a rook and knight, and so does black. And yet, black also has two extra pawns. And nevertheless, it is black who is losing. The reason being that black has a very unfortunate positioning of the king and rook. In fact, if black would not have his pawn on f7, he'd be much better off, because then it would be black who will be playing for a win. The unfortunate part here for black is that if the king goes to e7, then a fork comes immediately, winning black's rook. But what happens after king f8? Now things are not so simple, because if rook a8, then of course not king e7 but king g7, and black will be winning with two extra pawns. So what may be the move here that still wins for white? Believe it or not, it is a completely quiet move, a beautiful move. Simply rook g4. Sadly for black, this has two major threats. On one hand, white is threatening to check with rook g8, and then if king e7, knight d5 fork, and that same thing would happen if the rook moves to e3, check, and then knight check, and that's a fork, winning the black rook. Or if black moves the rook somewhere else, for example to d3, preventing any knight d5 ideas, then knight goes to h7, king e7, and rook e4. Simple but elegant checkmate. Well, it's quite an amazing endgame composed by Bent. Hope you enjoyed this lesson, learned some new things about endgames, and of course about making sure you're watching your queen, make sure it doesn't get trapped. Or of course, if your opponent lets you, you trap your opponent's queen. Thank you for listening. So long until the next lesson. Bye bye.